The relentless desert sun beat down mercilessly on the weathered wooden buildings of Dusty Creek, Arizona Territory, in the summer of 1887. The town had seen better days, much like everything else in this God-forsaken corner of the frontier. Saloons lined the main street alongside the general store, blacksmith shop, and the imposing brick building that once housed Hartwell's First National Bank. Young Tommy Mackenzie pressed his small frame against the alley wall, his stomach cramping from another day without food. At 12 years old, he'd been surviving on the streets for 3 years, since consumption took his mother and left him with nothing but tattered clothes and an iron will to live. His father had disappeared long before Tommy could even remember his face. The abandoned bank had been empty for 2 months now, ever since Edward Hartwell vanished in the middle of the night, supposedly with $10,000 from the vault. The townsfolk whispered about his betrayal, how he'd fooled everyone with his honest demeanor and charitable donations to the church. But Tommy had always sensed something different about the banker's disappearance. Hartwell had been kind to him, slipping him coins and never shooing him away like other merchants. As twilight painted the sky purple and orange, Tommy decided to explore the empty building. Maybe Hartwell had left something behind, some forgotten crumbs or overlooked coins that could buy him a meal. The back door hung askew on rusty hinges, creaking ominously as he slipped inside. Dust motes danced in the fading light streaming through dirty windows. The main office still held Hartwell's massive oak desk, papers scattered across its surface as if he'd left in tremendous hurry. Tommy searched through drawers, finding nothing but ink bottles and dried pen nibs. His bare feet made soft padding sounds on the wooden floor as he moved toward the vault, which stood open and empty as expected. Behind the vault, however, Tommy noticed something peculiar. Several floorboards seemed loose, their edges worn smooth, as if they'd been repeatedly lifted. Curiosity overcame caution as he pried at the boards with a rusty letter opener found on Hartwell's desk. The wood groaned and gave way, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. Tommy's heart hammered against his ribs as his fingers closed around a leather-bound ledger, its surface worn smooth by countless hands. The book felt heavy with secrets, its pages yellowed and filled with Hartwell's meticulous handwriting. By the dim light filtering through the windows, Tommy could make out columns of numbers, dates, and names that made his blood run cold. The first page contained a note in Hartwell's distinctive script: "If something happens to me, let this record serve as proof of the corruption that has poisoned our town. I pray someone with courage will bring these crimes to light." Tommy's hands trembled as he turned the pages, each one revealing deeper layers of treachery than he could have imagined. Mayor Benjamin Thornton's name appeared repeatedly, always connected to substantial sums labeled as land acquisition bribes and contract manipulation fees. Judge Silas Blackwood had apparently accepted payments to dismiss charges against known criminals and reduce sentences for those who could afford his services. Even Reverend Matthews, who preached about moral virtue every Sunday, had received money to keep silent about certain parishioners' activities. The ledger documented 3 years of systematic corruption, showing how a network of influential men had been bleeding the town dry while maintaining facades of respectability. Railway contracts, mining rights, water access deals, all had been manipulated for personal gain while honest citizens struggled to survive. Tommy realized with growing horror that Edward Hartwell hadn't fled with stolen money. He'd been murdered for what he knew, and this ledger was his final testament. The evidence was overwhelming, detailed enough to send half the town's leadership to territorial prison or worse. Thunder rumbled in the distance as dark clouds gathered overhead. Tommy carefully closed the ledger and held it against his chest, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on his young shoulders. Who could he trust with this explosive information? The mayor was clearly corrupt. The judge was compromised. Half the town council appeared in these pages. Then he remembered Sheriff John Morrison, the grizzled old lawman who'd served Dusty Creek for nearly 20 years. Morrison had a reputation for honesty that had cost him political advancement, but earned him respect among common folks. Tommy had encountered the sheriff several times during his street wanderings, and unlike other authority figures, Morrison had treated him with kindness rather than suspicion. Just last month, when Tommy had been caught taking apples from the general store, Morrison had quietly paid for the fruit instead of arresting him. "Boys got to eat," he'd told the indignant shopkeeper. "Hunger makes honest folks do desperate things." That small act of compassion had stayed with Tommy, marking Morrison as perhaps the only trustworthy adult in his world. Rain began pattering against the windows as Tommy made his decision. He wrapped the ledger carefully in his least tattered shirt and prepared to venture into the storm. Each step toward Morrison's office felt monumental, as if he were walking toward destiny itself. The streets were nearly empty due to the approaching storm, which suited Tommy perfectly. He stayed in the shadows, avoiding the pools of light cast by saloon windows and the occasional street lamp. His bare feet splashed through puddles as he made his way toward the sheriff's office, located in a small building next to the courthouse. Lightning illuminated the wooden sign reading "Sheriff" as Tommy reached for the door handle. Inside, he could see Morrison's silhouette bent over paperwork at his desk, a cup of coffee steaming nearby. The old lawman looked tired, his shoulders bearing the weight of maintaining order in an increasingly lawless territory. Tommy hesitated for just a moment, knowing that opening this door would change everything. The ledger contained enough evidence to tear Dusty Creek apart, to destroy powerful men and potentially endanger anyone associated with its contents. But the alternative was letting murderers and thieves continue their reign of corruption while good people suffered. Taking a deep breath, Tommy pushed open the door and stepped into the light. Sheriff David Morrison had seen many things in his 23 years of keeping the peace in Redemption Falls, but the sight of young Tommy McKinnon bursting through his door like a drowned rat carrying some mysterious bundle was something entirely new. The boy's eyes held a wild intensity that immediately put Morrison on alert, the kind of look that usually preceded either very good news or very bad trouble. "Easy there, son," Morrison said, rising slowly from his chair and moving toward the shivering child. His joints protested the movement, a reminder of his advancing years and the countless rough nights that came with the badge. "You're soaked through to the bone. What's got you out in this storm?" Tommy's teeth chattered as he unwrapped the leather-bound ledger with reverential care, his small hands shaking from both cold and excitement. "Sheriff Morrison, sir, I found something. Something important. Something that explains what really happened to Mr. Hartwell." Morrison's eyebrows rose at the mention of the banker's name. Hartwell's disappearance had nagged at him for months, though his official investigation had been quietly discouraged by higher authorities. Too many important people had been eager to accept the explanation that Hartwell had simply absconded with depositors' money, case closed. Now, looking at the ledger Tommy placed on his desk, Morrison felt a familiar tingle of instinct that told him the real story was about to unfold. The sheriff's calloused hands accepted the ledger with the careful reverence it deserved. As he opened the cover and began scanning the first entries, his face grew increasingly grave. Each page revealed another layer of corruption, another betrayal of the public trust. Morrison had suspected that something rotten was festering in Redemption Falls. But the scope of what Hartwell had documented exceeded his darkest suspicions. "Sweet Jesus," Morrison whispered, his voice barely audible above the thunder rolling overhead. "Tommy, do you understand what you've brought me? This here is evidence of crimes that go right to the top of this town's food chain." Tommy nodded solemnly, water still dripping steadily from his hair onto the office's wooden floor. "I can read enough to know those are bad things, Sheriff. Mr. Hartwell wrote down everything, didn't he?" Morrison turned page after page, his anger building with each revelation. Mayor Thornton had been taking kickbacks from the railroad company, selling out local farmers whose land lay in the path of the proposed expansion. Judge Blackwood had been fixing trials, letting dangerous criminals walk free in exchange for hefty payments. The corruption extended like tentacles throughout every level of government and society. "The poor bastard," Morrison muttered, referring to Hartwell. "He kept records of everything, probably thinking it would protect him somehow. Instead, it got him killed." As if summoned by Morrison's words, the sound of approaching horses began to filter through the storm's chaos. The sheriff's head snapped up, his hand instinctively moving toward the Colt 45 on his hip. Years of experience had taught him to recognize the difference between casual riders and men with purpose. And these horses were being ridden hard, despite the dangerous conditions. "Tommy, get behind my desk," Morrison ordered, his voice taking on the authoritative tone that had kept him alive through decades of dangerous encounters. "And stay down, no matter what happens." The boy scrambled to obey as Morrison moved to the window, peering through the rain-streaked glass at the shadowy figures gathering in the street. He counted at least 6 mounted men, their faces obscured by the brims of their hats and the darkness of the storm. Lightning illuminated the scene for a brief moment, and Morrison caught sight of Mayor Thornton's distinctive silver-trimmed saddle. "Damn!" Morrison cursed under his breath. Word had traveled fast, probably through whatever network of corruption connected all these criminals. They had come for the ledger, and they had come prepared for trouble. Morrison began reading aloud from the ledger, his voice growing stronger and more determined with each entry. Mayor Cornelius Thornton received $2,000 on March 15th for favorable zoning decisions regarding railroad expansion. Judge Silas Blackwood accepted $800 on April 2nd for dismissing charges against known cattle rustlers Thompson and Associates. The documentation was thorough and damning. Hartwell had been meticulous in his record-keeping, noting not just amounts and dates, but also specific details about the crimes being covered up. Morrison realized that the banker had been building a case, probably planning to take his evidence to federal authorities when the corruption had grown too much for his conscience to bear. Outside, Mayor Thornton's voice boomed through the storm. "Morrison, we know you've got Hartwell's papers in there. Send them out along with that damned Orphan boy, and we can discuss this like civilized men." Morrison barked a harsh laugh. "Civilized men don't murder bankers or threaten children, Thornton." He continued reading from the ledger, documenting each crime for Tommy's benefit as much as his own. The boy needed to understand the full scope of what they were fighting against. The entries grew more disturbing as Morrison progressed through the ledger. Payments to hired killers, bribes to federal inspectors, even money changing hands to cover up a series of suspicious deaths that had been ruled accidental. Hartwell's final entries revealed a man who had realized he was in too deep, who had tried to back out of the arrangement only to discover that his partners had no intention of letting him walk away alive. "Sheriff," Tommy whispered from behind the desk, "are they going to kill us too?" Morrison looked down at the frightened boy, seeing something of his own younger self in those determined eyes. "Not if I have anything to say about it, son. But I want you to know something. Whatever happens next, you did the right thing bringing this to me. This town's been sick for a long time, and sometimes you need strong medicine to cure a sickness." The sound of boots on the wooden sidewalk indicated that the men outside were taking positions around the building. Morrison checked his weapon and began gathering ammunition from his desk drawer. He had been expecting this confrontation for months, though he had never imagined it would come in quite this way. Through the window, Morrison could see lanterns being positioned strategically around the sheriff's office. The corrupt officials and their hired guns were preparing for a siege, but they had underestimated the old lawman's preparation and determination. Morrison had been planning for this day since he first began suspecting the truth about Redemption Falls leadership. "Tommy," Morrison said quietly, "I want you to stay low and keep quiet. No matter what you hear, don't come out from behind that desk until I tell you it's safe. Can you do that for me?" The boy nodded, clutching a piece of firewood he had grabbed as an impromptu weapon. Morrison smiled grimly at the sight. The kid had courage, more courage than most of the adults in this godforsaken town. The showdown is about to begin. Don't miss the explosive conclusion. Subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell to see how Sheriff Morrison and brave Tommy face down the corrupt officials of Redemption Falls. The siege of the sheriff's office began precisely at midnight, marked by the town's church bell tolling through the storm-lashed darkness. Sheriff Morrison had used the intervening hours wisely, barricading the doors and windows while making copies of the most damning pages from Hartwell's ledger. His years of experience in dangerous situations had taught him never to put all his eggs in one basket, and tonight that wisdom would prove invaluable. Tommy crouched behind Morrison's heavy oak desk, his small hands gripping the makeshift weapon he had chosen from the fireplace tools. The boy's fear was palpable, but so was his determination. For the first time in his short, difficult life, he was part of something bigger than mere survival. He was fighting for justice, for truth, and for the memory of Edward Hartwell. "Morrison!" Mayor Thornton's voice carried clearly through the storm. "This is your last chance to be reasonable. Send out those papers and the boy, and we'll make this easy on everyone." The sheriff positioned himself at the window, his weathered hands steady on his rifle despite the gravity of the situation. "The only thing that's going to be easy, Thornton, is explaining to a federal judge why you had a good man killed for doing the right thing." The first shots came from 3 directions simultaneously, a coordinated assault that spoke of military planning. Bullets splintered the window frame inches from Morrison's head, but his return fire was precise and measured. One of the attackers cried out in pain, his lantern tumbling into the muddy street and extinguishing with a hiss. Hours crawled by in tense standoff, punctuated by sporadic gunfire and shouted demands from the besiegers. Morrison rationed his ammunition carefully, making every shot count while keeping the attackers at bay. Tommy remained silent and still, though the sheriff could sense the boy's unwavering presence behind him like a guardian angel. As the storm began to subside and the first hints of dawn appeared on the horizon, Morrison heard something that made his heart soar with hope, the sound of multiple horses approaching from the east, moving at a steady trot rather than the desperate gallop of the corrupt officials' earlier arrival. Federal Marshal William Hayes emerged from the grey morning light like an avenging angel, accompanied by 6 deputy marshals armed with the latest Winchester repeating rifles. Morrison's earlier telegram, sent before the siege began, had reached the territorial capital just in time. The ledger's most crucial pages had been copied and dispatched with a trusted courier, ensuring that the evidence would survive even if Morrison and Tommy did not. "This is United States Marshal Hayes," the federal lawman announced in a voice that brooked no argument. "By authority of the territorial government, I order all of you to drop your weapons and surrender immediately." The corrupt officials found themselves trapped between Morrison's defensive position and the federal marshal's superior firepower. Judge Blackwood was the first to break, throwing down his gun and raising his hands high above his head. "I surrender!" "I was coerced. Thornton forced me to participate." Mayor Thornton's rage was magnificent in its futility. "You have no authority here, Hayes. This is a local matter, and we'll handle it according to local law." Marshal Hayes dismounted with deliberate calm, his hand resting casually on his sidearm. "Local law ended the moment you decided to murder a federal bank examiner, Thornton. Edward Hartwell was working under federal authority when you had him killed. That makes this a federal case." The revelation hit the remaining conspirators like a physical blow. Hartwell hadn't just been documenting local corruption. He had been gathering evidence for federal prosecutors. His murder had elevated their crimes from local graft to federal offenses punishable by death. One by one, the corrupt officials and their hired guns laid down their weapons and submitted to federal custody. Dr. Eleanor Whitman wept openly as the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, her medical practice ruined by greed. Reverend Matthews fell to his knees in the mud, begging forgiveness from a god he had betrayed for silver coins. Tommy emerged from behind the desk as the last of the criminals was led away, his young face transformed by the experience of seeing justice triumphant over corruption. Citizens of Redemption Falls began gathering in the street, whispered conversations spreading the news of their leader's downfall and the orphan boy who had brought it about. Sheriff Morrison placed a gentle, paternal hand on Tommy's shoulder, his weathered face creased with pride and exhaustion. "You saved this town, son. Takes real courage to do what's right when doing right puts you in danger." Marshal Hayes approached them, holding Hartwell's ledger like the precious evidence it represented. "This documentation is the most comprehensive record of organized corruption I've seen in 15 years of federal service. Mr. Hartwell paid with his life for gathering this evidence, but his sacrifice won't be in vain." As the corrupt officials were loaded into a prison wagon for transport to the territorial capital, Tommy watched with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. These people had controlled his town for years, their greed and corruption creating the desperate conditions that had made orphans like him invisible and expendable. Word of Tommy's heroism spread quickly through Redemption Falls, transforming him overnight from forgotten outcast to celebrated hero. Mrs. Sarah Jenkins, who owned the town's boarding house, immediately offered him a permanent room and regular meals. The schoolmaster, Professor William Aldrich, insisted that Tommy receive a proper education free of charge. Even the local banker's widow, Mrs. Helena Morse, spoke of providing for Tommy's future needs. But perhaps the most meaningful offer came from Sheriff Morrison himself. "Tommy, I've been thinking. I'm getting too old for this job and I could use a deputy. Someone young and honest, someone with courage when it counts. What do you say to learning the law enforcement business?" Tommy's eyes shone with tears of joy and gratitude as he accepted the sheriff's offer. For the first time in his life, he had a real future ahead of him, one built on courage and integrity rather than mere survival. The ledger was entered into evidence at the federal courthouse, where it would help convict not just the Redemption Falls conspirators, but a wider network of corruption that extended throughout the territory. Hartwell's meticulous record-keeping ensured that justice would be thorough and complete. As the sun climbed higher over Redemption Falls, Tommy McKinnon stood beside Sheriff Morrison on the steps of the jail, wearing a deputy's badge that represented far more than law enforcement. It represented the triumph of courage over corruption, of truth over lies, and of one determined orphan boy's refusal to let evil prosper in silence. The town that had ignored him for 12 years now looked to him as a symbol of hope and redemption. Tommy had not only saved Redemption Falls, he had redeemed it, giving it a chance to live up to its name at last. What an incredible journey from orphan to hero. Tommy's courage changed everything. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our thrilling Western adventures. Share this amazing story with friends who love tales of courage, justice, and redemption. Comment below which character was your favorite.